You finally escaped the relationship that was destroying you. The person who lied, manipulated, cheated, disrespected you in ways you swore you'd never tolerate. You're free now. You should feel relief, maybe even joy. But instead, you're lying awake at night thinking about them, missing them, wondering if you made a mistake, questioning whether it was really that bad. And here's the part that makes you feel insane. You don't miss the version of them that hurt you. You miss the person they were in the beginning, or the person you thought they could become, or even just the feeling of being with someone, anyone, even if that someone was slowly destroying you. Freud spent decades studying this phenomenon, and what he discovered is disturbing. The people who hurt you the most aren't the ones you forget easily. They're the ones you're most likely to miss, to idealize, to want back. And it has nothing to do with love. It has everything to do with how trauma bonds work, how your unconscious mind processes attachment, and why your psyche keeps pulling you back toward the very thing that wounded you. Let's start with what Freud observed about human attachment and trauma. In his work on repetition compulsion, Freud noticed that people don't just accidentally end up in similar painful situations. They're unconsciously drawn to them. They seek them out. They recreate them. And even after escaping them, they fantasize about returning to them. This seemed to contradict everything Freud initially believed about human motivation. We're supposed to seek pleasure and avoid pain. That's the pleasure principle, the foundation of his early theory. But repetition compulsion suggested something darker. People were seeking out pain, or at least they were unable to stop themselves from gravitating toward it. The key insight is that trauma creates a kind of psychological incompleteness. When something terrible happens to you, especially in the context of an intimate relationship, your psyche can't fully process it. The experience is too overwhelming, too contradictory to your sense of how the world should work. So instead of integrating the trauma and moving on, your unconscious mind becomes obsessed with it. It replays the scenarios. It fantasizes about different outcomes. It keeps pulling your attention back to the source of the wound, because some part of you believes that if you could just understand it, control it, or make it turn out differently, you could finally heal. This is why you miss the person who hurt you. Not because they were actually good for you, but because your relationship with them created unresolved psychological tension that your mind is compulsively trying to resolve. Freud would say, you're not missing them. You're missing closure, resolution, the fantasy that somehow the pain they caused could be retroactively transformed into something meaningful. Your unconscious mind is telling you that if you could just go back, if you could just make them love you properly this time, if you could just fix whatever was broken, then all that suffering would have been worth something. But here's the devastating truth. You can't resolve trauma by returning to its source. The person who hurt you can't heal the wound they created. They're not withholding the closure you need. They're incapable of providing it. The resolution you're seeking doesn't exist in them or in the relationship. It only exists in your own psychological work of accepting what happened, grieving what you lost, and integrating the experience without needing it to mean something other than what it was. But that's hard, painful work. Your unconscious mind would rather fantasize about the easier path of going back and making it work this time. Freud also identified what he called the mechanism of idealization in relationships. When you first meet someone, especially someone you're intensely attracted to, you don't see them as they actually are. You see an idealized version, a projection of your own needs and desires onto another person. You're essentially creating a fantasy person who matches what you want, and you're superimposing that fantasy onto the real human in front of you. This is normal. Everyone does it to some degree. The problem comes when reality starts contradicting the fantasy. When the person shows you who they really are through their hurtful behavior, you have two choices. You can update your perception to match reality, acknowledging that this person isn't who you thought they were, and adjusting accordingly. Or you can maintain the idealized fantasy and treat the hurtful behavior as an aberration, something to explain away or forgive because it doesn't fit your preferred narrative. Most people, especially people with certain attachment wounds, choose the second option. They cling to the idealized version and rationalize the reality. This is why you miss them even though they hurt you. You're not missing the real person. You're missing the fantasy version you created, the person you wanted them to be, the relationship you imagined you could have if only certain things were different. That fantasy is incredibly powerful because it was built from your deepest needs and desires. Your unconscious mind invested enormous emotional energy into constructing and maintaining it. Letting go of that fantasy feels like losing something precious, even though what you're actually losing is an illusion that was never real in the first place. Freud talked about the concept of cathexis, the investment of emotional energy in a person or object. When you're in an intense relationship, especially a tumultuous one, you're constantly investing emotional energy. Every fight requires energy to process. Every reconciliation creates a surge of relief and bonding. Every moment of uncertainty keeps you psychologically activated. Over time, you've cathected enormous amounts of emotional energy into this person and this relationship. That investment creates attachment regardless of whether the relationship is actually good for you. When the relationship ends, that emotional energy doesn't just disappear. It's still invested in the person who's no longer there. Your psyche is still oriented toward them, still expecting them, still processing experiences through the lens of the relationship. This creates a sense of loss and longing that feels like missing them, but it's actually your psyche struggling to withdraw and redirect all that invested energy. The more chaotic and intense the relationship was, the more energy you invested, and the harder it is to let go. This is why toxic relationships are often harder to get over than healthy ones. The constant emotional activation created deeper cathexis. There's also the phenomenon Freud called ambivalence, the simultaneous existence of contradictory feelings toward the same person. In healthy relationships, ambivalence is mild. You love someone and occasionally find them annoying. In traumatic relationships, ambivalence is extreme. You love them and hate them. You need them and resent them. You idealize them and recognize they're destroying you. These contradictory feelings can't be easily resolved, so they coexist in your psyche, creating constant psychological tension. When you're still in the relationship, this ambivalence is managed through the ongoing interaction. The good moments temporarily resolve the negative feelings. The bad moments get explained away or trigger attempts to fix things. But when the relationship ends, the ambivalence doesn't resolve. You're left with all these contradictory feelings and no way to discharge them. The positive feelings manifest as missing them. The negative feelings manifest as anger or pain. But without the person there to direct these feelings toward, they just cycle in your mind, creating the obsessive thinking patterns that characterize trauma bonds. Freud would say that what you're experiencing is a form of mourning, but you're not just mourning the loss of the person. You're mourning the loss of your own idealization, the death of the fantasy relationship you wanted, the collapse of the narrative you built about who this person was and what you meant to each other. This is why breakups from toxic relationships often feel more devastating than breakups from healthy ones. In a healthy relationship, the person you're losing is relatively close to the person you thought you had. In a toxic relationship, you're losing both the real person and the elaborate fantasy structure you built to avoid seeing who they really were. Another crucial element is what Freud called the repetition of childhood attachment patterns. The people who hurt you most deeply are usually people who recreate the emotional dynamics of your earliest relationships, particularly with your parents or primary caregivers. If you had a parent who was inconsistently available, who hurt you but also provided moments of care and connection, you learn to associate love with pain. You learn that relationships involve being hurt by the people you depend on. You learn to tolerate mistreatment because that's what intimacy looked like in your formative years. So when you meet someone as an adult who recreates that dynamic, your unconscious mind recognizes it as familiar. And to the unconscious, familiar equals safe, even when familiar is actually dangerous. The person who hurts you in ways that echo your childhood wounds feels like home. Leaving them feels like abandoning everything you've ever known about love and attachment. Missing them isn't just about missing that specific person. It's about missing the familiar pattern, even though that pattern has been destroying you your entire life. This is why statistics show that the majority of people, around 68% according to various psychological studies, report missing or wanting to reconnect with people who treated them badly. It's not because humans are masochistic or stupid. It's because trauma creates powerful psychological bonds that operate below the level of conscious choice. Your rational mind knows the person was bad for you, but your unconscious mind is running programs that were installed in childhood. Programs that say pain and love are inseparable, that you have to earn affection through suffering, that being hurt by someone means they matter to you. Freud also identified the defense mechanism of denial, where the mind refuses to acknowledge painful reality. When you miss someone who hurt you, part of what's happening is denial of how bad it actually was. Your mind selectively remembers the good moments, minimizes the bad ones, and constructs a narrative where maybe it wasn't that terrible, maybe you were too sensitive, maybe if you had just tried harder things would have worked out. This is your psyche protecting itself from the full weight of acknowledging how much time, energy, and emotion you invested in something that was damaging you. Admitting that the relationship was irredeemably toxic means admitting that you made a mistake, that you tolerated unacceptable treatment, that you wasted months or years of your life on someone who didn't deserve you. That's painful. It's much easier, psychologically, to maintain some ambiguity. To tell yourself it was complicated, that there were good times too, that maybe you'll never find that kind of connection again. These thoughts feel like missing the person, but they're actually your mind avoiding the painful work of fully accepting reality. There's also the factor of intermittent reinforcement, which Freud didn't use that exact term for, but absolutely understood in principle. When someone hurts you, but also occasionally treats you well, your brain gets conditioned in a way similar to gambling addiction. The unpredictability of when you'll get the good treatment creates a powerful psychological hook. You keep seeking that person out, keep thinking about them, keep missing them, because your brain is still hoping for the next hit of positive reinforcement that made all the pain feel temporarily worth it. The person who was consistently terrible to you is actually easier to get over than the person who was mostly terrible, but occasionally wonderful. That occasional kindness, that sporadic affection, that unpredictable moment of connection, it keeps your hope alive. It makes you think that the good version of them is the real version, and the hurtful version is just something that happens under stress or circumstances. You miss them because you're addicted to the high of those rare positive moments, and your brain has learned to tolerate enormous amounts of pain in pursuit of that intermittent reward. Freud believed that the only way to break these patterns was through analysis, through bringing unconscious material into conscious awareness. You have to understand why you're drawn to people who hurt you. You have to trace the pattern back to its origin, in your childhood attachment experiences. You have to recognize that what you're calling love is actually trauma bonding. You have to grieve the fantasy relationship you wanted, instead of pretending you might still somehow get it. You have to withdraw the emotional energy you've invested in this person and redirect it toward your own healing and growth. This process is painful. It requires you to sit with feelings that your psyche has been desperately trying to avoid. You have to feel the full extent of how much they hurt you instead of minimizing it. You have to acknowledge how much time you wasted instead of rationalizing it. You have to accept that the person you fell in love with never really existed, that you were in love with a projection, and that the real person was someone who treated you badly. These realizations hurt, but they're necessary for actually moving on, instead of remaining psychologically attached to someone who damaged you. You also have to understand that missing them doesn't mean you should go back. Your feelings are real, but they're not always a reliable guide to what's good for you. The fact that you miss someone who hurt you just means you have unresolved trauma and strong cathexis, not that the relationship was valuable or worth returning to. Freud would say your conscious mind needs to override your unconscious impulses. You need to use reason to protect yourself from patterns your unconscious mind keeps trying to recreate. The work also involves building new attachment patterns. You have to learn that healthy relationships don't involve constant pain and intermittent reward. You have to experience being treated well consistently, so your nervous system can start recognizing that as normal instead of boring. You have to tolerate the anxiety that comes with stable, predictable kindness, because your trauma-wired brain interprets stability as dangerous and chaos as exciting. This reconditioning takes time and usually requires therapeutic support, because you're fighting against patterns that have been reinforced for years or decades. Freud understood that humans are not primarily rational beings. We're driven by unconscious forces we don't understand and often can't control. The fact that you miss someone who hurt you doesn't make you weak or stupid. It makes you human. It means you have an unconscious mind that's trying, in its confused and maladaptive way, to resolve trauma and find completion. But understanding why you feel this way is the first step toward not being controlled by it. The 68% of people who miss those who hurt them aren't experiencing something abnormal. They're experiencing the predictable psychological consequences of trauma bonding, idealization, repetition compulsion, and unresolved attachment wounds. The question isn't why you miss them. The question is what you're going to do with that feeling. Are you going to recognize it as a trauma response and work to heal it? Or are you going to interpret it as a sign you should go back, condemning yourself to repeat the same painful pattern? Freud's message is clear. Your unconscious mind will keep pulling you back toward unresolved trauma until you consciously process and integrate it. Missing someone who hurt you is your psyche's way of saying you have work to do. Not work on the relationship. That's over and should stay over. Work on yourself. Work on understanding why you bonded to someone who damaged you. Work on healing the childhood wounds that made that dynamic feel like love. Work on building the capacity to recognize and maintain healthy attachments instead of mistaking intensity and pain for depth and connection. The person you miss doesn't exist anymore, if they ever existed at all. What you're missing is a fantasy, a hope, a story you told yourself about what could have been. And as long as you're oriented toward that phantom, you can't orient toward reality. You can't build something real with someone else. You can't even build a healthy relationship with yourself. Freud would say the work of psychoanalysis is making the unconscious conscious, bringing the hidden patterns into the light where they can be examined and changed. That's the path out of missing people who hurt you. Not forgetting them, but understanding them and yourself clearly enough that the compulsion to return finally loses its power.